Did you know red vermouth isn't actually made from red wine? Have you ever wanted to know what the difference between a dry vermouth and an extra dry vermouth is? Let's get into it and sort it all out. This is the second half of my introductory series on vermouth. If you haven't already seen part one, diving into a brief history of how vermouth came to be, I'll post a link in the comments below. So let's break down some categories and what the stylistic differences are between them so that when you're standing in a liquor store staring at a wall of vermouth or other weird herbal wines with French names, you'll know what to buy for that drink that you want to make at home. Vermouth falls under the umbrella category of aperitif wines. These are also known as aromatized wines, but I find the word aromatized is a little bit of an annoying word and it kind of makes you sound a little more snotty than aperitif, so I'm just going to stick with aperitif here. Aperitif wines are generally bitter wines, around 18% alcohol by volume, and they're usually flavored with botanicals. Vermouth is an aperitif wine that can be broken into two primary categories, sweet and dry. Within those categories is a vast number of vermouth styles. For now, just a smidge more history is going to put all this into context. Vermouth, as it is known today, was first created in 1786 in Turin, Italy. It was a sweet red vermouth and it caught on like wildfire. So much so that the French heard about this new fancy thing that the Italians were drinking and they wanted to get in on the game. In 1813, France, Joseph Noilly, of the brand Noilly Prat, he created the first dry vermouth. The French dry vermouth was created distinctly different from the Italian version in that it was dry, it used fewer botanicals, but it was more bitter and had a pale straw color. In contrast, the sweet, rich red, also called rosso, vermouth found in Italy, it uses almost 2 to 3 times the amount of botanicals, yet it is less bitter, more sweet, and is colored with caramel. Due to their geographical heritage, this is actually often why sweet red vermouths are also called Italian vermouth, while dry, pale vermouths are often called French vermouth, regardless of it actually being made in that country or not. Now, I really want you to forget absolutely everything you know about wine and all of the terminology associated with wine, because vermouth terminology is predominantly based around its history rather than it actually making logical sense from a wine perspective. If a word in the wine world means one thing, it's very likely that it means the complete opposite in the vermouth world. Let's take the word dry, for example. In the wine world, dry wine means it is not sweet and has very little residual sugar, if any at all. That is not the case for vermouth. Because of the established timeline with Italian sweet vermouth coming out first in 1786, and then the French jumping on the bandwagon 27 years later in 1813, a lot of vermouth terminology is all about how it relates to the original Italian rosso vermouth. Dry vermouth does not mean a vermouth that is not sweet. It simply means that it is drier than the original Italian sweet vermouth style, but it is still slightly sweet, just less than the Italian vermouth. Typically, a dry vermouth will have about 30 grams of sugar per liter, but it can go all the way up to 50 grams, whereas sweet vermouth can range from 80 grams of sugar per liter all the way up to 180 grams of sugar per liter. Now, if you're in North America, there's another vermouth style that you've probably heard about and see a lot more than just dry vermouth. It's extra dry vermouth. That is a dry vermouth that is drier than dry vermouth. It's extra dry. Extra dry vermouth usually has less than 30 grams of sugar per liter, but it still does contain a little bit of added sugar. Another example of this backward terminology is the use of red and white. In the wine world, you all know what red and white wine means. In vermouth, however, that's not the case. The vast majority of vermouths, regardless of them being called red or white, The base wine is actually almost always made with a neutral white wine. What makes them red or white has nothing to do with the flavor or type of grapes used. Let me repeat that. It has nothing to do with how they taste. The only thing that differentiates a red vermouth from a white vermouth is the fact that one of them is colored with caramel to give it a red orangey hue, while the other is not. That's it. You can have sweet red vermouths, you can have sweet white vermouths. You can also have dry white vermouths and dry red vermouths. Dry red vermouths, however, are actually not very common, but there's no reason why you can't make it. They're just not that common. What is very common, though, is sweet white vermouths. These are also called Bianco vermouths if they're made in the style and tradition is Italian, or Blanc vermouths if the style and tradition is French. Often because these are pale in color, people think that these are like in the middle of a Rosso and a dry vermouth. No. They're still very much sweet vermouths. They just don't have color added. Historically, there was a lot of back and forth between Italy and France. Remember when I said that the French created dry vermouth in response to the popularity of the Italian vermouth? Well, the French style became so popular itself that the Italians, they wanted in on that game too, and they created the Bianco vermouth style. Similar in appearance to the French vermouth, but sweeter as it was the preference in Italy. Then of course the French noticed this new Bianco vermouth and said, hey, that's pretty neat too. So they created the Blanc vermouth. And eventually also started making a Rouge vermouth as well, while the Italians also started making their own dry vermouth. Yeah, I know, it's super confusing with all the back and forth, but that's how these traditions came to be and how the terminology was developed. The Spanish also started making their own vermouth traditions, but that is a whole video of itself. With all these styles emerging, it was often common for many of the more budget-conscious producers to make their two sweet varieties, Rosso and Bianco, exactly the same, but to just omit the caramel color from one of them so that they could easily produce two products. Some producers will even do the same thing between their Rosso and their dry vermouth. It's the same vermouth, but one has more sugar and caramel while the other one does not. Those practices are more common, I think, in the budget categories or historical brands, while I think the majority of modern producers now, they just make separate recipes for each. Now, while the vast majority of vermouths are made with white wine, that isn't to say red wine isn't used. It sometimes is, but that's just less traditional and it's more of a brand's choice, and it has to do with what actually makes that vermouth a Rosso vermouth or a dry vermouth or any other style. The reason red wine often isn't used is because the tannins and flavor in red wine can overwhelm the botanicals. So the producers have to be very careful and selective with the red wines that they choose to use. These vermouths still end up being quite wine forward rather than botanical forward in their flavor. I should also touch base on botanicals. All vermouth must contain wormwood as the primary bittering agent. However, outside of that requirement, producers can use any botanicals that they want. I mean, there's certainly common ones that are used for each style, but it's largely up to the vermouth maker to determine what those are. So, in summary, a vermouth is a wine flavored with wormwood and other botanicals. It falls into two categories, sweet or dry. Within those categories, you have Rosso and Bianco on the sweet side, and dry and extra dry on the dry side, with a whole bunch of modern tweaks and other brand specific styles in between. That's it. There's no other restrictions on what makes a vermouth a vermouth. If it's wine with wormwood, you've got vermouth. If you want to make a Negroni, for example, a traditionally flavored Rosso vermouth is what you need. And I don't think producers should call their vermouth Rosso unless it has caramel added and it actually tastes within the style of traditional Rosso. A dry vermouth doesn't have caramel and it is drier, than sweet vermouth and is most often used in the martini cocktail. Actually, we should talk about the base wine a little more. And again, I'm using the term wine loosely here because I don't think the base wine actually really matters all that much when making vermouth. Typically when you're making vermouth, you are using at least a dozen different botanicals to make the wine. That is a ton of flavor. So generally producers try to use a neutral white wine or a wine that doesn't really have a lot of flavor, because you're adding so much flavor on top of that any nuances in the wine, they get lost. So producers typically use wine that can't be sold on its own because it's pretty bland and boring. Pretty bland and boring wine works really, really well for vermouth. As that's the case, it really does show that even from the perspective of a vermouth maker, the base wine is actually not important. Neutrality is what we're after, not special, unique wine flavors. Therefore, I wouldn't really get too hot and bothered if a vermouth is made from a white wine, a red wine, a mead, a cider, or any other fruit wine, because it's not the base wine that makes a vermouth, but it is the balance between botanicals, sugar, spirit, and wine that really matters. For example, a producer can make a neutral dry mead or cider just as effectively as they can make a neutral white wine. So both can be used for vermouth so long as they use wormwood. I'd also love to know in the comments below, how do you enjoy drinking vermouth and how were you first introduced to it? Or if you have any other questions, or what do you want to know more about? Because I'd really love to turn your questions into more videos. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time.